Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at some really fascinating source material. It's all centered around Thomas Piketty's hugely influential book, Capital in the 21st Century.
Right.
And what makes these sources, I think, particularly interesting is how they unpack Piketty's, complex economic arguments, but through a really surprising lens, an old French novel.
That's right. The sources we have, they blend this deep literary insight with, well, centuries of economic history and pretty rigorous statistical analysis.
Okay.
So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to cut through all that data, and maybe some of the drama too, to pull out the most important nuggets.
Right.
Things like understanding the core arguments about wealth inequality, how inherited wealth versus earned income has shifted across history, and what that famous, sometimes controversial RG formula actually signifies.
And doing it without getting totally bogged down in every single number.
Exactly, giving you the core understanding.
And it all kicks off with this scene just ripped right out of a 19th century novel by Balzac, Old Goriot. It paints this incredibly vivid picture of a very stark, almost brutal choice about, how to get ahead in life.
Hmm.
So get ready to explore centuries of data, social dynamics, and these core economic ideas about who gets wealthy and why.
So the novel, it's set around, what, 1810 in Paris,
Mm.
France under Louis VIII, a time with incredibly rigid social layers.
Yeah.
And we meet this character, Vautrin, who's deeply cynical.
Hmm.
He spots this young, ambitious guy, Rastignac, just starting out.
Right. New in the city.
And Vautrin essentially pulls Rastignac aside and just
Yeah.
lays out two paths, two ways he can make something of himself.
Okay, path one.
Right. Path one, Vautrin paints his, the traditional route. Hard work, merit. Tells Rastignac, look, you could study law, grind your way through, become a prosecutor.
Sounds respectable.
Yeah, but you'd start under some unpleasant boss, maybe making just 1,000 francs a year. By age 30, maybe 1,200 francs. And you could spend decades just hoping that by 40, you might land one of these incredibly rare chief prosecutor jobs.
How rare.
Vautrin points out there are only 20 in all of France, and 20,000 people vying for them. Or, he says, you could be a lawyer, spend 10 years just trying to build clients, flattering people, hoping someone notices you.
Doesn't sound easy.
Not at all. And even then, Vautrin says, by 50, you might be one of maybe 5 people in all of Paris earning 50,000 francs a year as a lawyer.
Wow. So it's presented as this huge long shot, right? Depends on luck, sucking up to people, very uncertain rewards.
Mostly.
Then path two, according to Vautrin, is dramatically simpler, faster,
Much faster. Find a rich girl, marry her.
just like that.
He even points one out. Victorine, not particularly beautiful, he says, but from a wealthy family, seems to like Rastignac. Marry her, Vautrin advises, and boom. Instant access to £1,000,000 inheritance.
It's 1,000,000 francs.
His argument is blunt. If she gives you her heart, she'll open her purse. And Vautrin calculates, standard 5% return on capital back then. That £1,000,000 immediately yields 50,000 francs a year.
Wait, that's the same amount as that super rare top lawyer Vautrin mentioned?
Exactly the same, but instantly, letting you live like 10 times more comfortably than the prosecutor path.
And the sources highlight this incredibly cynical observation in the novel. If you succeed this way, society doesn't really question how you got there.
Yeah, Balzac suggests this wasn't just, a fictional plot device.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, out of 60 good marriages in Paris at the time, something like 47 were essentially these kinds of financial deals.
47 out of 60.
That's what the source suggests Balzac implies. The implication is powerful.
Yeah.
In that world, 19th century France, relying on talent and hard work to get truly rich, largely a fantasy.
Social climbing through marriage was the more reliable route, expected even.
Right. It makes you wonder if Balzac himself, who apparently dreamed of marrying rich, poured some of his own observations into that scene. It's brutal.
Okay, so this stark choice in the novel talent versus inherited wealth, this is precisely the kind of fundamental question Thomas Piketty tackles, but not with just one story.
No, he uses vast historical data. The sources explain he leverages these recently rediscovered historical statistics covering national income, wealth, across major economies: U.S., Canada, Europe, China, Japan.
Where does he get this detail?
Crucially, income tax records. They became common around 1910. And even more valuable, inheritance tax records. France, amazingly, has an unbroken series going all the way back to the Revolution in 1799.
Wow. Okay, so he's using centuries of tax data to figure out empirically, for someone like Rastignac at different points in history, which path actually paid off more.
Exactly. Building a career through work and skill, or inheriting wealth, or marrying into it, which yields more over time. income from labor or income from capital.
And Piketty illustrates this with a graph, right? Comparing two groups in France over centuries.
Yeah, a really powerful graph. It compares the living standards of two groups from 1790 right up to projections for 2030.
Okay, who are the groups?
The top 1% who inherited the most wealth, he calls them the rich second generation, versus the top 1% with the highest wage income, dubbed the worker emperors.
Worker emperors, I like that. And the baseline for a living standard.
It's the average wage of the bottom 50% of workers, so kind of a basic standard of living measure.
Okay, so looking at that chart, what does it dramatically reveal about these two paths over time?
Well, at the start, around 1790, exactly when Balzac's novel is set, the inherited wealth group, their living standard was 25 to 30 times that of the average worker.
25 to 30 times.
Yeah, whereas the top 1% from wages, the worker emperors, their standard was closer to maybe 10 to 12 times the worker average.
Big difference.
Huge. This period before 1890 is what Piketty calls the patrimonial capitalism era. It's the world of Balzac, Jane Austen, and the data just starkly confirms. Inherited wealth profoundly dominated earned income.
The old Goriot era, as the sources call it. Marrying money was the better bet, statistically.
The data backs up Balzac's cynicism completely. But then something shifts dramatically between about 1890 and 1970.
What happens?
Well, you have family fortunes just decimated by two world wars. Then this huge post-war economic boom that redistributes income. And for the first time in French history covered by this data, the worker emperors, people hitting massive success, high salaries, through what we'd call merit, hard work, talent.
They overtake the inheritors.
They actually surpass the living standards of the rich second generation, the ones with inherited wealth.
Wow. So that period, roughly the mid-20th century, that really seems like the historical moment where the ideal of meritocracy, hard work being the main path to top wealth, was most closely aligned with the actual data.
Exactly. That was the peak, you could say. But then, after 1970, the trend reverses again.
Oh.
Economic growth slows down in Europe, social structures stabilize, and that inherited wealth model starts to reassert its dominance.
So the old Goriot era comes back.
It returns, where inherited wealth outstrips earned income at the very top. And Piketty's data projections actually show this gap widening into the future.
That chart really is powerful, boiling down centuries of history to the relative success of inherited versus earned wealth.
It is. But the sources point out that this trend, which we see so vividly in France, Piketty argues it's just a surface manifestation of something deeper,
Okay.
a more fundamental global root cause, the dynamic he summarizes as RG.
R is greater than G. This is where it gets really interesting, right?
This is central. So R represents the rate of return on capital. Think profits, dividends, rent, capital gains, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And G represents the economic growth rate, how fast the overall economy, the total income and output is growing.
Got it.
Piketty argues that the central contradiction of capitalism is RG.
And he has data suggesting this holds true over 2,000 years of human history. Is that right?
He does. And that data suggests that for most of human history, the net rate of return on capital, so after tax, has been remarkably stable globally. It hovers around 4 to 5% per year.
4 to 5% return on capital consistently.
In stark contrast, the long-term global economic growth rate, G, has only been around 1 to 1.5% per year.
Wow. So the overall economic pie grows pretty slowly, but the slice of that pie going to capital owners grows significantly faster.
Precisely. And this fundamental imbalance, Piketty argues, has been the case for nearly 2 millennia. And it naturally leads towards a distribution of income and wealth that increasingly favors those who already hold capital over those whose income comes mainly from labor.
But the sources note that this really deeply entrenched long-term pattern was disrupted, specifically in the 20th century.
Right. That period from about 1913 to 2012 saw a temporary reversal of this trend. It led to greater equality in income distribution compared to previous centuries.
And during that unique period,
The rate of return on capital, R, dropped significantly, down to around 2.5%, while economic growth, G, accelerated to about 3%.
so for roughly a century, G was actually greater than R.
Exactly. GR.
What caused that unusual period? Why did it flip?
The sources point to a few key things. One, the massive physical destruction of capital during the two world wars just wiped out fortunes.
Yeah.
Two, the implementation of widespread progressive taxation on capital and inheritances, especially between 1914 and 1945. That significantly reduced the net, the after-tax return on capital.
Right, the government takes a bigger slice of the R.
Precisely. And third, rapid economic development fueled by new technologies and also population growth. This combination created that window, that period where earned income could potentially keep pace with or even surpass inherited wealth.
Which might explain why, many people in the late 20th century really felt like hard work was the primary path. And maybe why ideas like trickle-down economics gained traction.
Possibly. Because for a while, the rising tide did seem to lift more boats relative to the capital holders, comparatively speaking.
But according to Piketty's forecast for this century, the 21st.
He predicts that the fundamental force, RG, will reassert itself,
Why?
with slower population growth expected, potentially slower technological gains compared to that 20th century boom, and crucially, without the shock of world wars or equally strong progressive capital taxes. He forecasts that the return on capital will again outpace economic growth.
And the gap widens.
He projects it will widen, potentially returning levels of inequality by the end of this century, or maybe early next, that we haven't seen since before the Industrial Revolution. Basically bringing back that old Goriot-era dynamic.
That outlook sounds pretty stark, doesn't it? So if urge is this powerful force pushing towards increasing inequality, what does Piketty propose we actually do about it?
Well, his main policy proposal to counteract this trend is implementing a progressive global tax on capital.
Global. How would that work?
He suggests rates starting really low, maybe 0.1% for wealth below 1 million euros, then increasing to 1% for 1 to 5 million, 2% for 5 to 10 million, and scaling up significantly, maybe 5 to 10% for billions in wealth.
And the goal here isn't to, dismantle capitalism.
No, the explicit goal isn't that. It's to curb the tendency towards extreme income inequality that Gilly fosters, to create what he described as a more harmonious, potentially more stable society while still preserving private property and free markets.
Okay.
However, the sources then pivot.
Right.
They raise some pretty significant critical questions and counter-arguments about the solution and maybe even the forecast itself.
Exactly. There are challenges.
Okay, let's dig into those. First, there's the question of whether that progressive capital tax would even work as intended.
Right. Critics highlighted in the source article raised concerns. Is it too theoretical? Could it have unintended consequences?
Like what?
Well, one argument is that taxing capital too heavily could directly damage the entrepreneurial spirit, the investment needed for wealth creation in the first place. Right, if the return arc gets taxed down too much.
Maybe the overall pie doesn't grow as much, which makes arguments about fair distribution maybe less meaningful if there's less wealth overall to distribute.
Makes sense. What else?
Plus, they point out, for a capital tax to truly be effective globally, to prevent capital just fleeing to low-tax havens, you'd need an unprecedented level of international coordination.
Something like a world government for capital, as the source puts it.
Pretty much, which individual countries just can't achieve on their own.
So any single country trying it might just risk scaring investment away.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the second, maybe even more fundamental question? Is Piketty's prediction the return of erg dominance, rising inequality, is it truly inevitable? Baked in?
Well, Piketty himself, coming at it as a statistician, says no. It's not a certainty, not some kind of economic destiny.
Oh, okay.
He sees the 2,000 years of erg as a historical fact, based on the data he looked at, but not a logical or physical necessity. He suggests you can imagine alternative scenarios. A parallel world, as he puts it. Maybe a world where capital has no practical use beyond just being stored, so R equals 0. But the economy still grows moderately through tech progress or population increase, so G is greater than 0.
So in that kind of world, G would always be greater than R, just by definition.
Exactly. Without any government intervention needed to counteract inequalities stemming from ARGI, because the dynamic itself would be different.
So his view is, while the data shows this powerful historical trend, he believes through deliberate policy choices or maybe fundamental improvements in how economies work, capitalism could be steered towards a more equal outcome. His prediction isn't a guaranteed fate.
That's his position. The source writer introduces a counterpoint here, drawing on ideas from social physics.
Social physics, looking at society like a physical system.
Kind of. It attempts to look at human societies through the lens of physical laws, large systems. And from this perspective, when you look at huge populations, individual free will or specific policies might be less significant than underlying systemic dynamics.
Almost like viewing individuals as particles in a gas or something.
A bit like that analogy, yeah. Thinking about large-scale statistical behaviors. And the idea extends. Maybe creating wealth isn't just about economic activity. Maybe it follows principles found in physics, like irreversible entropy reduction. It's a complex idea.
Okay. So how does that relate to inequality?
Well, the thinking goes, if wealth creation follows these sorts of principles, then wealth distribution itself might potentially follow natural, perhaps even physical laws,
Meaning?
meaning that income inequality could be a kind of stable, inherent outcome, almost a form of natural order in complex human systems, independent of specific policies.
Is there data supporting that view?
The sources reference some classic data points. Like Vilfredo Pareto's observation, late 19th century, he noticed that in many countries, across different types of wealth, roughly 20% of the population tends to hold about 80% of the wealth.
The famous Pareto principle, the
Yeah.
80-20 rule.
Exactly, and the source even mentions an older example. An Israeli mathematician analyzed ancient Egyptian archaeological data from like 1370 BC, used house sizes as a proxy for wealth, found a similar pattern of distribution even way back then in a totally different society. It approximated that Pareto distribution.
So the provocative suggestion raised by this counterpoint is maybe Piketty's prediction, the return of the old Goriot era, isn't just about specific economic forces like tax rates or growth speed.
It might be tied to something deeper, almost fundamental principles governing how wealth naturally concentrates in large human systems, which could make the reemergence of concentrated inherited wealth more likely than not, kind of regardless of specific policy efforts to stop it.
So what does this all mean for you listening? We started with this fictional young man, Rastignac, in a 19th century novel, facing that stark choice. The hard path of earned success versus the fast track of inherited wealth.
Yeah.
We then followed that thread through centuries of actual historical data compiled by Piketty. We explored how the balance between income from labor and inherited wealth has dramatically shifted over time, and how it's significantly driven by that powerful, long-term dynamic of RG, where capital's return outpaces overall economic growth.
Exactly. We saw how ARG tends to favor capital holders over labor earners over the very long haul, how that trend got temporarily disrupted for about a century by unique events, wars, taxes, rapid growth,
Yeah.
and Piketty's data-driven prediction that the old Goriot era, that dominance of inherited wealth, might be returning in the 21st century. We also dug into his proposed solution, the progressive capital tax.
And crucially, explored those challenging questions raised about its practical effectiveness and whether inequality is maybe a more fundamental outcome of complex human systems. Ideas from social physics, the Pareto principle.
Yeah, those deeper questions.
So this deep dive, it gives us this powerful, long-term historical perspective on wealth, opportunity, inequality. It connects the choices of a fictional character from 200 years ago to these fundamental economic forces and maybe even deeper principles shaping wealth distribution today. And it raises, I think, an important question for you. In a world where these dynamics of capital and growth are constantly shifting and where maybe those forces favoring inherited wealth are reasserting themselves, how do these historical trends and this whole idea of RG shape how you think about your own path, your own opportunities, and the broader economy we live in right now?
It's a lot to consider.
It really is, linking Balzac's Paris, those choices, to your world today and what truly drives success.